Hi, everyone. Welcome to Taking Back the Narrative, Season 4, Episode 3. Today's topic is going to be unpacking the history of terrorist organizations in the Middle East. I'm very honored to welcome my dear friend and guest, second-time guest to the podcast, Matan Zimman. Matan, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Lorraine, for having me. This is actually my second time on the Taking Back the Narrative podcast. First time was 2 years ago when I brought a family friend to talk about the history of of Yemenite Jewry. Uh, for those of you who didn't hear, my name is Matan. I'm currently a third year student finishing up my undergrad in government and sustainability at Reichman University. I served 3 years in the IDF as a combat soldier in artillery. I will be starting grad school in October of this year in counter-terrorism and intelligence, also at Reichman University in Herzliya.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So let's start just right off the bat. Everyone now talks about Hamas and Hezbollah before all these quote unquote popular terrorist organizations. There was the original. So we need to start off with the PLO. So what a lot of people get wrong is, first of all, even describing what it is. So it's the Palestine Liberation Organization. Again, these are all terrorist organizations we're talking about. And what's interesting to me, Matan, is that I hear so much, even in Jewish publications, that it's a liberation movement. And we know it's no such thing because what these terrorists wanted to liberate was Israel, which is Palestine. And for those who might not know, all Palestine means is it was a colonizer term for Israel, Judea, from 136 AD when the Romans defeated Jews. And it took the Romans three expensive wars over a period of dozens of years and even centuries to finally defeat Jews, and actually contributed to the collapse of the Roman Empire just because it drained their resources, used up their legions from all over, all four corners of the empire. So when the Romans defeated Jews in Judea in 136 AD, it is a misnomer that they use the term for the Philistines, which are not a Semitic tribe at all. The Philistines were a Greek, Cretan seafaring group that lived in now Jewish Gaza. So all the Romans did was take the Greek term for Judea from the 5th century BC. It was the lingua franca of the day and just applied it to their territory. It was nothing against Jews. They did that to all other groups that were defeated by the Romans. And why the Greek term? Because again, it was the language of the Mediterranean area, of the Mediterranean East. So the PLO meant Palestine in its truest form, which is the Judean homeland, the Jewish homeland. So these terrorists wanted to liberate Palestine, right? So we know it's the Jewish homeland from
Correct.
Jews, literally push Jews into the sea. So how was the PLO formed? Who was part of the PLO? Who were the backers? It was all the KGB's doing. And how did we get there? Well, originally the Soviet Union had fairly good relations with Israel because a lot of the Jews in Israel were socialists. So they really thought strongly that Israel would become a communist vassal state and do the Soviet Union's bidding in the Middle East. Well, a couple of factors then transpired. Jews in Israel were starting to hear a lot more about anti-Semitism, state-sponsored anti-Semitism from the Soviet Union. They obviously were hearing about the gulags. So that was more on a population level that made them pause about being so close to the Soviet Union. From a policy point of view, Israel simply pissed off Israel pissed off the Soviet Union, particularly the KGB. How? It sided against the Soviet Union in 1956 during the Suez Canal War. And that was the cherry on top. And then just to finish it all off in terms of any uh, repair to its relationship was that it dared, quote unquote, dared to win a war against the Soviet backed Arab armies in 1967. We were not supposed to win whatsoever, but we did. So how dare we win a offensive war against us? Well, the KGB had a few other tricks up their sleeves. So in 1964, because remember, Israel had already pissed off the KGB in 56, so this was all brewing. The KGB was creating fake liberation movements all over the world. So in the Middle East, this was their way of spreading communism and being against the West in what they perceived was a Western ally. And it was. Israel was a Western ally, but Israel was not and is not part of the West. Israel is hefty in the Middle East. So what they did, they backed 422 Arabs who actually were hyper specifically former Syrians that now lived in Israel. So we're talking about 422 Syrian Israeli Arabs. And in 1964, at in Cairo, the Arab League Summit created the terrorist organization, the PLO. And what's interesting is that in its original charter in 1964, they very much excluded having any control over Judea and Samaria, which at the time was occupied illegally by Jordan, and also did not want anything to do with Gaza, which at the time was occupied by Egypt. And they also had nothing to do with a region that they called Al-Hama, which is the northern Jordan Valley. So they only amended that charter in 1968 after Israel reclaimed that land after its win in 1967. So that was the PLO. So what is the difference? And also the KGB is in charge of inventing the Palestinians, AKA what they did, they lumped together the various Arab occupier groups who lived in Israel, all over Israel, including Gaza, including Judea and Samaria. And it was those 422 Syrian Arab Israelis who said, you know what, now that Israel is a sovereign state, a sovereign nation, and the Jews are calling themselves Israelis, we don't want to share that same moniker as Jews. We need our own identity and something different than just Arabs. So that is how the KGB swooped in with Operation SIG. And those of you who would like to visit my website, tbtnisrael.com, there's an entire section on Operation SIG. It was a propaganda campaign to paint Israel as a Nazi state and also an occupier. And again, they stole 1,812 years of Judean history in Israel when Jews were called Palestinians. Those were the occupation years. And again, applied it to the Arab occupiers. So what's the difference between the PLO and the PA? We hear the PA so many times also in the news. So the only difference is that the Oslo Terrorist Accords created the PA, which is the Palestinian Authority, not a legitimate government, as many think it is, and unfortunately some Israeli leadership as well, but it is a terrorist group that's simply in charge of the Arab occupiers locally, whereas the PLO is still around and is in charge of global affairs for the same terrorist organization. So, and then just to end on the misinformation note about the PLO, Arafat had nothing to do with the creation of the PLO or the false creation of the Arab occupiers being called Palestinians. That was all the KGB, and Arafat was not even leader of the PLO until 1969, and he was the third leader. So that's going to lead into Al Fatah. So Arafat did found a terrorist organization group, Al Fatah, in Egypt in 1958. And that is how the KGB operatives even knew about Arafat. They plucked him from that seemingly obscure organization in Egypt. They fabricated his birth records to pretend that he was born in Jerusalem when he was not. He was very much born in Cairo, and then created a whole story behind how he's a Palestinian and his quote unquote people need liberation, et cetera, which is what the KGB did. It created propaganda, and everything we see on college campuses today stems from 1967's Operation SIG, which again wanted to turn the world against Israel. It did so successfully within the Arab populations, but did not do so well with Western audiences. So they needed to come up with those lies, and then they used the leftist academia to do so. So everything we see right now should not be a surprise. It's been in the works over 50 years. So with that, Matan, I'll hand it to you to talk about another important organization, the Muslim Brotherhood.
So most importantly, when it comes to talking about Islamic terrorism, each ideology has our own parent ideology from where everything stems from. In this case, we will be talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in Cairo in Egypt in 1928 by radical Sunni cleric by the name of Hassan al-Banna, who for almost 2 decades ran this organization, which the sole purpose was Islamic fundamentalism. In a way, you can say that Hassan al-Banna was way ahead of his time compared to some of the other names that we will cover down the list, as well as other students of the Muslim Brotherhood. And one of Hassan al-Banna's greatest uh, uh, clerics who assisted him in founding the Muslim Brotherhood was Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and was also known as Hitler's Muslim ally during the war. Al-Husseini, not to detract from the Muslim Brotherhood, inspired the Farhud, which was a pogrom that took place in Baghdad in Iraq, where 200 Iraqi Jews were murdered over Shavuot, and hundreds of women were raped. Businesses were burned to the ground. It was a pillage, basically. And under Hajj Amin al-Husseini and Hassan al-Banna was actually Yasser Arafat, and in the 50s, Mahmoud Abbas, and eventually Ahmed Yassin, who we'll cover further down the podcast. So in 1947 or 48, Hassan al-Banna would be assassinated. But by that point, the Muslim Brotherhood had infiltrated its way into Europe, predominantly Western Europe, which was not secured by the Iron Curtain, which was East Germany and eastwards after World War II, when the Soviets liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi Germany.
So I have a question. I just popped in. Was the Muslim Brotherhood tied at all to the Wahhabi sect in Saudi Arabia, or was inspired by them? Was there any connection between the two that you know of?
That's a very good question. Obviously, with Wahhabism and Salafism are basically how the ideology that most of the Sunni terrorist organizations, particularly those that spawned from the Muslim Brotherhood, which obviously would be Al-Qaeda, where you had Abdullah Azzam, who was considered the father of the global jihad, and one of his students was Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Mohammed Atef, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who would be instrumental in the September 11 attacks. So in that case, you can say it was Wahhabism that, in a way, was similar Wahhabism that was originally partaken by Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who founded Saudi Arabia in 1932. The only difference was that Al Saud, Ibn Saud, was not radical, but mainly did it in a way of ideological purposes of taking the Arabian Peninsula and installing his family as the ruling class, which we have today, which is hence Saudi Arabia.
So I have a bit of a historical add-on to the House of Saud. I'll save that for the end. So the Okay, a little bit of a story of why I decided to include the PLFP. Not only is it important to talk about them, I was personally embarrassed because I was at a political conference about 2 years ago and I met an Egyptian who I befriended, and he told me that, a little while later, that he worked with the Mossad to overthrow Morsi during that revolution in Egypt in 2014. And we went out for coffee, and he's talking about PLFP a lot. And I'm just drawing a blank at the time. It's not much talked about in the Western press. I mean, obviously, I had seen those abbreviations before, but I had no idea what that meant. And when I asked him, he looked at me. He's like, "Wait, how do you, as a Jew, not know what PLFP means?" So, with that, I'm sure we can educate many other people, Jews and non-Jews, who might not know about that terrorist organization.
So the PFLP, which stands for Popular Liberation Front for Palestine, was created during Operation SIG by George Habash, who was a Marxist Christian Arab born in Israel, not far from Ashdod, before Israel was eventually became recognized by the so-called United Nations in 1948. So the PFLP was more of a precursor for what we'll experience with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The only difference is the PFLP did not sought to go around attacking Jews, but rather a one-state solution where the Jews and the Arabs would live together. Obviously, the Jews would be second-class citizens compared to the Arabs, similar to what the Arabs did to Jews with the dhimmi status in
Mhm.
Islamic countries, particularly in North Africa, which was very apparent and taken very seriously compared to other countries, specifically in the Middle East, which necessarily didn't subjugate Jews to being second-class citizens.
Well, in Iran, also, just depending where Jews lived. What's interesting about Iran is that when the Persians were Zoroastrians, there was no anti Semitism. But as soon as Islam spread into that country, Jews were also treated as dhimmis, more so outside cities than in Tehran. But there are stories where, Jews were called dirty Jews. They didn't want to share food with Jews. Jews couldn't sue Muslims in any courts. If it was raining, Jews had to step aside from the street, let the Muslims walk on the main street. Jews could only walk on the side. So it definitely was prevalent throughout Muslim nations, just yeah, depending on the ruler. Like the same thing with the Ottoman Empire. For the first 200 years, the Ottomans treated Jews very well. And then after 1600s, that's when everything went downhill with the Ottomans and enforcing dhimmitude on Jews, even in Palestine. So that was an interesting tie-in to what you were talking about.
Correct. And not just mainly, it was just in like Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan, the main cities of Iran where Jews were not subjugated to dhimmi status. But if you look in Yazd or Mashhad or in
Mhm.
Karmanshah, it was very present in those
It just
cities.
depended where one lived. So I had a question. So you mentioned that the founder was an Arab Christian.
Yes, George Habash, who
So
uh,
mhm.
with Habash, he actually called for a lot of the airline hijackings in the 70s were inspired by him, and people who would rise up in infamy took note of Habash's actions, specifically Fadi Shakak, who would be the founder of Islamic Jihad, as well as Ahmed Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi, who we'll cover very soon, who were the founding fathers of Hamas,
Are,
another
so
well-known.
the question is, are Arab Christians typically involved with these terrorist organizations, or was he more of an anomaly? And the reason I ask, because as you know, you live in Israel, the actual Arab Christians in Israel, most of them are genetic Jews. You know, like
Correct.
Arabs, the Arab Christians in other Muslim nations never came to Israel. It was all the Arab Muslims that came in, and most of them came in between the two world wars. And the first Arabs who came to Israel didn't even set foot in Israel until after the 7th century. So the reason I ask this, because we have a group of genetic Jews in Judea and Samaria who were converted to Islam in the 11th century by an Egyptian caliph. And you know who I'm talking about, right? Like
Correct.
there are a
Specifically,
couple
those
of clans, right? There are a
Christian
couple of
areas
clans
like
there.
Bethlehem, for example, or Ramallah were actually
Yeah,
genetic Jews. They were just converted to Islam, but they
right.
still like kept secretly
Mhm.
their traditions.
And also
Eventually,
they married each other because they were huge clans. So Israel knows who they are, but so some of them became the most infamous terrorists because they wanted to prove fealty to their new religion, their new identity, what have you. So I'm just thinking that since a lot of the Arab Christians are in Israel are genetic Jews, a good example I'll give. I'm more than confident. I'm sure you know the activist. He's an Israeli activist, Yosef Haddad. He says
yes.
that he's Arab and he's Christian. I bet anything, if he were to do a genetic test, he's a Jew. Just the last name, it wouldn't make sense if his family were Arab Muslims. So my question is again, like how prevalent are Arab Christians in these terrorist organizations, or was he just like a one of few one-offs?
In the broader picture, when you compare them to other terrorist organizations, you can say that Habash was more of an anomaly. Although, if you look in, you have terror cells of Islamic of IJ in Beit Lechem or Ramallah, where there are a good amount of Christian Arabs who do assist and are terror cell members. But in terms of rising to the peak and also taking notes from Arafat and also serving as an inspiration for much more violent organizations, which we'll cover down the road. You can say that Habash was, in a way, an anomaly
Mm.
in the
And
story.
and so today, does PLFP play a role? And if so, like, are they uh, like tied to the PA? Any ties with Hamas, or what are they doing these days, if anything?
Pretty much these days, the PFLP are often overshadowed by the activities that are committed by Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and getting into the Shiite terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, although they definitely provide support to Hamas, to Islamic Jihad. In the end of the day, it's the same end goal to sort of liberating what they call Palestine, which is another term of
Israel.
just
Yeah.
erasing the Jewish state, which would be adopted in Yassin's charter when Hamas was created. I believe that the PFLP are more of like behind the scenes or more of like a shadow of the influence that it used to had, especially in the 70s and 80s before the rise of Islamic terror in the Middle East, descendant of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So the big one these days, of course, Hamas, and a slightly less known, but just as lethal, from what I've seen, Islamic Jihad. So could you give us a breakdown? Okay, so also I think the dates would help too, because I read that Hamas was started in 1982. I've read other reports that Hamas began in 1987. So even that to dissect. And also, I read a lot about the Qassam brigades. Is it a military wing? How do they fit in?
Tom Brigade's the military wing, which was founded shortly after Hamas was officially founded in 1987 by Ahmed Yassin, Mahmoud Zahar, and Abdulaziz Rantisi. Originally, Yassin wanted Hamas, which was in before 1987, which he brought up in 1982, a year after Islamic Jihad was founded by Fahadi Shakak.
Oh, so Islamic Jihad came first.
Correct, in 1981
Interesting.
by
Just
Fadi Sakak and Ramadan Shaleh, who would actually be one of the FBI's most wanted terrorists, which we'll get to briefly. But
and just to interject on for 1 second. So where exactly was Hamas founded? Was it from Gaza or somewhere else?
it was specifically in Gaza by Ahmed Yassin, who was the spiritual brains behind Hamas. Yassin was quadriplegic most of his life from following a sporting accident, depending on which sources you want to read. So Yassin, who was one of the top students in Egypt when he studied in Islamic University in Cairo, where he studied directly under the Muslim Brotherhood and rose up the ranks, and as well as listening to a bunch of other infamous individuals like Arafat or Habash, for example. So Yassin, with the intent in his charter, literally said that the text says that calls for the erasure of the Jewish state to disappear from the map, which is the charter of Hamas, especially when it comes to the whole from the river to the sea slogan that is chanted on college campuses. Right after Hamas was founded by Yassin, Rantisi, and Zahar, was the outbreak of the first Intifada, which killed about over 200 Israelis over a 6-year period. Eventually, in 1990, Yassin would be imprisoned, would be sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing of 2 Arabs who were working undercover with the Mossad, which provided leaks to arrest not only Yassin, but Yahya Sinwar, who was known as the executioner in Gaza. And
Mhm.
around this time was the creation of the Qassam Brigades by Salah Haruri, who would become Ismail Haniya's deputy in 2017 until his assassination in 2024. And among the new operatives that Salah Haruri brought, along with Salah Shahida, who would take over the Qassam Brigades, while Haruri would be more of the strategist behind the scenes, was Mohammed, who was the most instrumental figure in Hamas, especially in the second Intifada and also terrorist attacks in the 1990s, with which Def under Saleh Shahida transformed the Qassam Brigades from a sort of paramilitary organization to the military wing, similar in a way of the SS under Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich's leadership, for example. During the 90s, Def, along with Ahmed Jabari and Marwan Issa, who would also rise in infamy shortly after the Second Intifada, conducted scores of terrorist attacks against Israelis and also against Jews worldwide, in a way being funded from behind the scenes from Iran, which we'll get to down the road. So under Def's leadership was under the Second Intifada was when Hamas really escalated. Eventually, Yassin would be released from Israeli prison after a failed assassination attempt on the political chief of Hamas, Khalid Mashal, on Jordanian soil, which forced the royal family, to spare Mashal's life to prevent an uprising in Jordan. And that was what led to the Second Intifada. In 2004, both Yassin and Rantisi were killed in a targeted airstrike months apart, only a month apart from each other, which the leadership itself of Hamas was entirely under the hands of Ismail Haniya, who was Mashal's deputy. And behind the scenes, the military wing, you had Mohammed Def, Ahmed Jabari, and Marwan Issa.
So, a couple questions. Okay, so one question is, was Hamas created because they thought the PLO was not killing as many Jews as they wanted, was not terrorist enough, or were there other reasons why Hamas was created
The sole
originally?
reason, the sole reasons why Hamas was created by Yassin and Rantisi was solely for the purpose because the PLO, they viewed the PLO, most notably Yasser Arafat, for being soft with negotiations, where in 1993 they joined the Oslo Accords, and that created a lot of rifts between between the Al-Qassam brigades under Saleh Shahida, who would be assassinated in 2002. But under him, you had many people who were outraged at the fact that they would go for a two-state solution, which and that pissed off Hamas to levels that are obviously unimaginable, where you had Rantisi going on television declaring declaring that martyrdom would be better than accepting a two-state solution, which would be the leading factors of the Second Intifada.
So it's interesting you bring up the two-state solution and the Oslo terrorist accords, because Arafat famously was saying, well, he was enacting taqiyya, which maybe some audience members not know. It's lying to enhance the objectives of Muslims, and it's permissible in the Muslim religion, in the Islamic religion. So Arafat at the time was saying that, I say what I need to say in English, but taqiyya, what I'm saying to you, my Arab audiences, is different. So the Arab audiences knew from the start that there was no good faith coming from the PLO in the Oslo Terrorist Accord negotiations or the agreement. So did Hamas not get that message that there was never an intention for a two-state solution? There was never an intention for the PLO to enter into any peaceful pact with Israel, or was that just, or they knew and it was just an excuse to create an even more, or just as a violent organization, but maybe like not as regulated as the PLO?
So, in the perspective of Yassin and Rantisi, who were still running the show even by the turn of the 20th century to the 21st century, Arafat's end goal was just more or less to stall relations between the United States and Israel, which under Rabin entered the Oslo Accords, which were obviously a very huge mistake,
Oslo terrorist accords, as we call them.
which
Yeah.
paid heavy prices as well as for ineptitude planning on the assassination attempt on Khalid Mashal on Jordanian soil. That would
Right.
also lead to the rift between the PLO and Hamas. But by 2002, 2003, during the eventual height of the Second Intifada, was when we saw Arafat talking behind the scenes with Yassin and Rantisi, saying that, look, I only agree to these accords just to stall out Israel, to think that we are trying to look for peace, but at the end of the day, our fight is the same fight. We're both
AKA Takia, which I think more of the Western audience and Jews in Israel need to like understand what Takia is. Absolutely. Okay, so the other follow-up is, and this is interesting to me because I didn't know about it, what was happening in Jordan at the time. So unfortunately today we look at Jordan, aka Israel East, because Jordan is nothing more than an Arab occupier state inside Israel. Churchill in 1922, as colonial secretary, stole 78% of the Jewish homeland and renamed it Transjordan. So there's no ethnicity called Jordanians. 65% of them are former Israeli Arabs who fled to Jordan starting in 47 to help Arab armies kill Jews faster. And 35% in Jordan, and I've been to Jordan and I had a great tour guide who was Bedouin. And even the Bedouin tour guide admitted that he's a genetic Jew, that the Bedouins in Israel and Jordan, same thing, because it's still a part of our homeland, are genetic Jews who descended from Jews who came home from the Hijaz. So there were Jews who left for the Hijaz, which was encompasses Medina and what would become Mecca, and some other cities in Arabia. They left Judea after 586 BC, the destruction of the Second Temple. And then there was another great cohort that left, which were mostly Bar Kokhba rebels after 136 AD. The Arab pagans welcomed them with open arms. They had no problems with Jews. There was great relations between Judea and the Hijaz. All of that changed with the creation of Islam in 614 AD. So my question is, the the Jordanian government, right? Or the fake puppet king, as many Zionists call him, because there is no kingdom of Jordan, as we know. So back then, you were saying that that rift led to further, did you say like further creation then of that organization because they kicked them out? Or because like even now, like, is it true or not true? Like, is Jordan funding terrorism these days, or was that something that they were doing just in the past?
In the past, there was, but mainly the point was the Jordan was for King Hussein
Right.
to basically keep the people happy, which majority of the Jordanian people were sympathetic to Hamas. A lot of people would listen to mashals delivering fatwas or call for actions against the Jews. But deep down, I would like to believe that the Hashemite clan were not in favor of Hamas. And after the death of King Hussein, his son King Abdallah came in. Hamas was expelled, Mashal was expelled, along with Salah Haruri,
Mhm.
were scattered. Haruri would be in and out of Israeli prisons until being exiled to Syria, where he would be in Lebanon, and Haruri would be the link between Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran.
Mhm. But it seems like Jordan, even now, like doesn't care what is being done against Jews in Israel. They just don't want terrorism in their fake country, right? Like again, like there are no Jordanians; those are all Arab occupiers and a bunch of genetic Jews who came back home. So, if anything, it's the Jordanian, like I guess, like nationality, but it's not an ethnicity. It's not a people. So, do you find is that more accurate that they care more just that there's no insider terrorist attacks as opposed to what happens to Israel? Or am I wrong here?
No, you're definitely correct in that aspect. I think the Jordanians saw what happens in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which is why they don't want terrorist organizations operating within their country, which is why in 1999 Hamas was expelled from Jordan.
Right.
Mashal would flee to Qatar. He would be one of the few of the big fish of Hamas who have not been assassinated yet. Khania was assassinated last year, along with Aruri, Death, Isa, and Salama and Gandor, who were military chiefs who reported directly to Deif and to Mohammed Deif and Marwan Isa. But I think the point is that the Jordanian people realized that they don't want somebody like Ibrahim Akil, who commanded Hezbollah's Radwan, the commando force, butchering them the same way how Lebanese people are butchered for collaborating with Israel, as well as they hearing about how Yassin and Sinwar, along with thousands of others, would be arrested by Israel for killing not only Jews but also native Arabs who didn't agree with their methods or their ideology. So I would think that the Jordanian people kind of realize that we don't want to get involved with your stuff, but we don't want terrorism on our border.
Okay,
So
so
it's
just
like a
just
win.
got it. So
Eh,
just correct. So it's Jordanian nationals, not people, and
Has to
there are no native Arabs in anywhere aside from Arabia. So just so the audience.
Arabs living in Jordan, is what I meant
Yeah,
to say.
exactly. Yeah. So because otherwise we're rewriting history and we're like upholding, what the
Uh,
lies that
narrative.
adds Arab land. So you mentioned Hezbollah. So to me, okay, so I was reading a lot, doing a lot of research about the
Mhm.
Israel-Lebanon war, from 1982.
You also you wanted me to discuss briefly Islamic Jihad.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
So
Mhm.
Islamic Jihad was basically created in 1981 as a direct proxy of Iran into Jewish Gaza. Under Keep in mind, Islamic Jihad is not a Shiite terrorist organization, but they share the same uh, Salafism ideology, which
Mhm.
or whatever the Shiites follow, which is what led to Islamic Jihad being one of the most funded and armed terror organizations in Gaza, even almost more so than Hamas until much recently, which would lead up to October 7th, which was orchestrated by Sinwar, Def, and Isa, which Islamic Jihad was which does not have political representation. It's basically militant cross-border attacks and close-range IED attacks on the Israeli borders, initiated by Shakak and Ramadan Shalach. Fadi Shakak was assassinated in Malta, but in a shooting by Mossad operatives in Malta, which led to Ramadan Shalach being brought into the scene. Where with Shalach, he was definitely a pragmatic ideologue compared to Yassin, Rantisi, Def Sinwar, or Isa Aruri, which was just a go out, which was more of like just being a ragtag militant band with no real direct allies solely for Iran, where Shalach would be eventually he died in Syria, not never being prosecuted. The new head of Islamic Jihad, Ziad Nakhala, who is much more violent than Shalach or even predecessors, almost on the same level. You can compare Nakhala to Zarqawi,
Mhm.
the butcher in Iraq, or al-Baghdadi for how he's running the Islamic Jihad from deep in Lebanon, which is for the first time we see Islamic Jihad and Hamas working together for a common purpose, which is destroying Israel. Where you have
I
the Al-Quds Brigades, which
mhm.
is the military wing of Islamic Jihad. Recently, we managed to assassinate um, uh, mm, the chief of the Islamic Jihad military wing, Al-Quds Brigade, Baha Abu Alata, who was responsible for for the event of 2K on the Islamic Jihad side. So that's a bit of the rundown of Islamic Jihad.
Okay, so I had a question relating to the Jewish genocide and the hostage negotiations are going on now. So Hamas is one of the negotiators, and obviously terrorist vermin, but some of the hostages were also being held and still are being held by Islamic Jihad. So when any deal is reached by Hamas, do they have control over Islamic Jihad? Or can Islamic Jihad say, like, well, we're not in these negotiations. So if we have hostages, you know, like they're screwed over because we're not in these talks. How does that all work right now?
So I think the way that it works is that Islamic Jihad, from vaguely behind the scenes, does have their people in the negotiation team, but Hamas is more or less running the show because
Okay.
with Islamic Jihad, they don't have what you would call political expertise like Hamas
Mhm.
has. Islamic
Okay,
Jihad,
and
it
it
is.
goes back to what you said. So you're saying, so like, let's say like a deal is reached, and like like what's going on right now, that they keep arguing about, like, Israel's trying to get at least 11 released hostages. They're saying 5 and 8. Like it's ridiculous what's going on. My opinion, what should have been done, a full siege on
I
Jewish
agree.
Gaza. Everyone should have been wiped out. They're all guilty. It's not just Hamas. Getting rid of Hamas is not going to do anything because the entire Arab occupied population in Gaza and Judea and Samaria is Hamas. But but yeah, like I was always wondering, like, so okay, so Hamas does have the authority in Islamic Jihad's eyes to say, like, look, like we're giving up these hostages, you're holding on to XYZ, you need to, step up. So that's what's going on, right?
I think it's also a way to buy time because we didn't only take out like we didn't only take out people like Mohammed Daf, Marwan Isa, Ahmed Gandor, Rafa Salama, or Ayman Nofal, who are the highest ranking military wing officials of Hamas. We've also taken out high ranking members of Islamic Jihad. So I think it's just a way for them to stay in power and continuing exercising their so-called dominance over Jewish Gaza, that the best thing to do is to buy time, release the
Mhm.
hostage. That is basically what is in the hands of Musa Abu Marzouk, who is the new political head of Hamas, who after the assassination of Sinwar in October of last year, a year after the Jewish genocide began. Whereas you have Darwish, who is head of Hamas in Gaza, taking a much more pragmatic approach, along with Mohammed Sinwar, the younger brother of Yahya Sinwar, who replaced Mohammed Def as head of Al Qassam,
Okay.
are trying to limit the negotiations or just not take part in the negotiations at all. It's
Is
a
it true? Is it true that Sinwar's brother is even more ruthless than uh Yahya Sinwar? I read about it that somewhere, but I don't know if that's true or not true or
I would definitely think that the Sinwar brothers are among the most ruthless. Like
Mhm.
they're not strategists like Salah Haruri, for example. I mean, Haruri is definitely one of the biggest fish that we've assassinated. He directed the kidnapping and murder of the three boys, which led to Gaitan in 2015, along with the creation and the formation of the Al-Qassam brigades. But if I had to pick who would be more violent, I think more or less they're both equally as violent, but in terms of who's willing to maximize civilian suffering as well as being a strategist would definitely go to Mohammed Def to be
Okay.
like the worst.
Okay, so yeah, and he's the one where like I know that Israel celebrated the most when they finally got him. So Hezbollah. Okay, so I was reading a lot about the Israeli Lebanon War of 82, right? So essentially, what was happening from 67 or 64. Well, I think we should go back to like what Lebanon was. Lebanon was not a real country before 1920. It was part of Syria, and the Christians wanted their own safe haven of sorts. So in 1920, Lebanon was created. And so it's really important. This is why I cannot stand when Jews especially say Israel is a state, because states are created, countries are not. So Israel is not a state because Israel was never created. Israel is a 4,000-year-old country that was liberated by brave Jews after 20 years of fighting the British on our soil. And Lebanon and Jordan were both created. So that makes them states, and Israel is not a state. So Lebanon was originally what, like 94% Christian, and it was very high. It was 94 or 95% Christian when it was created. Then their tragic mistake was in 1948, they decided to let in the Arab occupiers who were fleeing Israel, not because we kicked them out. Unfortunately, we should have done that. And there was a debate whether to kick out Arabs or not. The decision by the liberal establishment was not to kick out the Arabs, but they fled voluntarily. Some of them, and others, the Arab armies insisted that you have to go. We need 2 weeks. So we're gonna drive the Jews into the sea, and then you can come back. So most of the people who left to help Arab armies kill Jews faster. So that's something very important to understand for the audience at large. So so the Lebanese Christians accepted these refugees. They're not refugees because Israel never kicked them out. So they accepted these Arab occupiers into Lebanon. And over time, obviously, the population boomed. So increasingly, it was more and more Muslims. The Muslims were attacking the Christians. A lot of Christians had to flee Lebanon. And what the PLO was doing was using Lebanon as a terrorist base to attack Israel in the 60s, in the 70s. And by 82, Israel had had enough. And that's what prompted, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is like what I've, amassed over the years. So that's why Israel, quote unquote, invaded Lebanon. It was not an invasion of sorts. It was to stop the terrorist base that Lebanon had turned into, right? So we had the first Lebanon war, pardon me, in 82, and then we had to come back in 2006. So how does Hezbollah fit into that picture? Was it as soon as the Israelis decided to finally, they've had enough, and they took as much charges as possible against the terrorist groups in 82, or was this like a slow churn? If you can give a little bit more background about all of that.
Of course. So obviously, we know that in 1980 to 1988 was the Iran-Iraq War, which Israel unwittingly supported Iran due to the threat of Saddam Hussein obtaining nuclear weapons, as well as the firing of Scud missiles, which took place towards the late 80s to early 90s. Unwittingly, the money that Israel, gave to
Mhm.
fund Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, would be used to create Hezbollah in Lebanon, which over time would eventually become the de facto state actor that we have in Lebanon, infiltrating the parliament, infiltrating military infiltrating social society.
Right. Actually, that's an interesting fact. I did not know that how it was actually created. But then why did Iran accept kafir money, right? That's what they think of Jews and Israelis in particular, or they didn't care where the money was coming from.
I don't think Iran cared where the money was coming from. I think that Iran had tricks up the sleeve. Ultimately, with Hezbollah, there were a lot of disagreements with the founder of Hezbollah, along with Abbas al-Musawi, who would effectively take over Hezbollah in 1990 after kicking out the weaker leaders of Hezbollah, who were known to not be as brutal enough to in the first Lebanon War, which is what had at last into what would be a stalemate by the 90s, and towards the 90s was when it really escalated, which in 1992, Israel assassinated Abbas al-Musawi with a targeted airstrike, and then Hassan Nasrallah would become the general secretary for the next 3 decades,
Mm.
assisted by Naim Qassem, who is now the head of Hezbollah after a majority of the Hezbollah leadership has been taken out, specifically Fuad Shakur, who was responsible for the Marine barracks bombing in
Right.
1980, Ali Karaki, who was head of the Hezbollah, the southern front of Hezbollah, who was instrumental in the synagogue bombing in Buenos Aires in 1994,
Mhm.
along with Wissam al-Tawil and Ibrahim Akil, who were the commanders of the Radwan force, which were ultimately planning another Jewish genocide, which was called Operation Galilee, to do a cross-border invasion of Yeshuvim and Israeli towns in the north, similar to what we experienced on October 7th, which was launched by Mohammed Daf and Marwan Issa, and ultimately Sinwar.
So you mentioned that Hezbollah is entrenched within the Lebanese society. Could you give a little bit more color as to how entrenched they are? So, like, when I read articles that say, like, oh, like, Israel defeats Hezbollah. Is that even possible if Hezbollah, like, is it like, do they have Hezbollah operatives in the Lebanese army? Obviously, Hezbollah sits in this part of the Hezbollah government. I mean, not part of the Lebanese, see, Hezbollah, Lebanon, it's the same thing in a way. So how entrenched are they actually? Is it actually?
I think they're a lot more entrenched than what we think, and definitely what experts who definitely have a lot more knowledge than both of us think. For example, Fuad Shakur, who was the highest operative killed, I would believe that he was number three in Hezbollah behind Nasrallah and Qasem. He was originally a high-ranking member in the Lebanese army, but
Mhm.
he decided to jump into Hezbollah after seeing how he could be rising more towards the power even before Nasrallah took over, when it was al-Musawi being the top dog of Hezbollah, for example. Ultimately, another person who was responsible for allowing for pushing for Hezbollah to infiltrate the Lebanese military was Mohammed Swor. Swor was Mohammed Swor was the head of the drone unit, and as along with Unit 910, which was uh, another commando unit similar to Radwan, which was responsible for a lot of drones and rockets coming in to into Israel. And then you have the Nasser and Aziz units by Mohammed Nasser and Talib Sami Abdallah, both of whom were killed in the pager attack in
The
September.
best Mossad operation ever to have.
Also very vital individuals. Whereas with that basically allowed Ibrahim Akil and Wissam Al Tawil to strengthen Radwan in preparations for another October 7th, which we uncovered shortly after we invaded Lebanon, days after we eliminated Nasrallah in an airstrike, along with two of his potential successors. One of them, Hisham Safieddin, who was a longtime friend of Nasrallah and also had ties to Shakur, Swor, Tawil, and Akil.
Mhm.
Uh, and a lot of the other top brass of Hezbollah, which thankfully we actually took a majority of them out. Besides Qasem, only two or three others were spared from the pager attacks, as well as the relentless bombardment that we did over Beirut. almost the same neighborhood that we actually killed Saleh Haruri in just
Mhm.
earlier that year, the deputy head of Hamas.
So I understand, when retribution attacks are needed, right? Like, so I know that right now Israel is, I mean, I don't actually agree with Israel going back into Gaza for military, just because I think, again, like a full siege can do the job that it needed to do. But then again, like I also understand the need for retribution, right? Like they just, the idea of just killed the terrorists that murdered the Bibas family so
Correct.
brutally. So that is needed. But in terms of, okay, like we see headlines like, okay, Israel eliminated this Hezbollah leader, that Hezbollah leader, but another one pops up, right? Because it's like playing like whack-a-mole with terrorists, right? Like they're little rats, just like pop up, right? So would there ever be, in actuality, a scenario where Israel can eliminate Hezbollah or no, right? Because like if it, like you said, it's so entrenched within that infrastructure of Lebanon, or is Israel just trying to batter it down as much as it can and then manage it better from that more weakened position?
My opinion would be that Israel is trying to end the war without involving more casualties, both on our side and ultimately in Lebanon side, which there's a lot more civilians in Lebanon than there is in Gaza, in Jewish
Right.
Gaza, for example. But I believe that with Naim Qassem, he's not like the other names that I've mentioned, let alone compared to Nasrallah. He's not the most intelligent man to be running a terrorist organization. I just think with Qasim, it's just like indiscriminate killing, but he doesn't have the resources because we took out Akil, we took out Swar, we took out a lot more other members vital. We took out Ibrahim Kubazi, who was head of the missile unit for Hezbollah. So basically, all that Naim Qasim can do is just talk, but not create any additional action against
Not
Israel.
not an act in a way, like just a bunch of rhetoric
It's just rhetoric, basically.
at this point.
We took out Kabazi, we took out Shakur, we took out Swar, we took out Muhammad Nasser, we took out majority of the high command of Hezbollah, which it's definitely going to take time, but I believe that Israel should continue striking, similar to how the US continued striking against Al Qaeda and Islamic State, even after the events of 2014, or even after, definitely
Oh
after
yeah, like decades, like we're still doing strikes on ISIS here and there.
Qaeda. I mean, recently we took out Zawahiri, who succeeded bin Laden. The new leader of Al Qaeda was hiding in Iran, Saif al-Adel, who also had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and also had connections to Yassin and Rantisi, which is another thing important to note. Another thing to note is that the terrorist who was responsible for the murder of the Bibas family had direct ties to Mohammed Daf and Marwan Issa.
Hmm.
So basically, it's basically a matter of close ties to step up when one of them is killed, to step up to the plate
Right.
over the organizations.
Now you're saying a lot about funding. So we know that obviously Iran funded and funds Hezbollah. What about Qatar? Okay, how do you properly pronounce that country? Is it Qatar? Is it Qatar? Everyone pronounces it so differently.
I think with Qatar in a way, it was just money. It was just money in a way, which
So do
obviously
they,
took a lot
so do
to
they directly fund Hezbollah and Hamas? Or, well, I know, by the way, like let's be honest here. You know what's going on with Bibi and his meetings with the Qatari officials in
as
2018, and then
well.
the Qataris funneled money through Israel for Hamas. That's being investigated whether Bibi got paybacks, whether his office got any kickbacks from that. But in general, so like how direct of an involvement is Qatar financially to all of these terrorist organizations?
I think they're definitely involved tremendously in the funding. They also provided safe haven for Khalid Makhtal, Ismail Hania, and Salah Haruri. I mean, briefly until he made his way to Lebanon, which put him in strikes in our crosshairs to eliminate him once and for all. I think with Qatar, the money is going in to Hamas, but also to Islamic Jihad and indirectly to Hezbollah. But the main source to look into is Iran and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who were vital in creating in funding not only Hezbollah and Hamas, but also the Houthis and the insurgent groups in Iraq, as well as various groups in Syria, for example, including the
So,
Assad regime.
so paint like the whole, if you can, the spider web of terror that's emanating from Iran. So they have okay, so what exactly is the IRCG, right? It's the Iranian Revolutionary
Guard Corps or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
yeah, this Islamic Revolutionary Corps Guard, right?
Yes.
Okay, so so their main purpose is what? Just to wreak terror wherever they're called to do. Or, okay, so who are they? And then what are the other connections to other groups that Iran funds? So we don't know, obviously Hamas, the Houthis, and how are they used? So like, like we know that the documents were just uncovered that Hamas had asked Iran for what, like $500 million to destroy Israel, right? So that this was from 2021, I believe those documents were uncovered,
Yeah.
from there. So is it like,
The correspondence between Sinwar and
right,
the Iran.
right,
And
and
the
that was
thing,
2021, right?
thing is, the Iranians have their own man in Lebanon who was the
Mhm.
coup, or who worked directly with Aruri, who had ties to Nasrallah, who also communicated with Sinwar and Def, was Ismail Khani, who was head of the Quds Force, who was head of Quds Force, who also had direct ties to Qasem Soleimani, who was the commander-in-chief of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Mhm.
Which is important to see when you compare those, is that the IRGC is a state actor terrorist organization. It's not like a non-state actor to what you would see with the Iraqi groups or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, for example. I think in the middle of the spider web, you definitely have Iran, and
Mhm.
through Iran's through Iran's arms, you definitely have the other terrorist organizations who specifically have the reach to attack Israel, for example, which most importantly, which most importantly, you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas, you have Islamic Jihad, who can, as we saw on October 7th, directly launch direct attacks against Israel. You have missile attacks, which could be by the Houthis, who obviously gets training from from the aerospace corps of the IRGC to use long range rockets, as well as drones that were specifically given to Iraqi groups, specifically Kataib Hezbollah and the Nujaba movement, which are the most powerful of the Iraqi groups.
Wait, can you back up a little bit? What exactly is going on in Iraq? Like there's the Iraqi militia groups. Um, and then also you were talking about before that, there's some groups that are Sunni, some groups that are Shiite. Is one sect more violent than the other, or like they're both the same? And what has happened in Iraq since the Americans left?
Since the Americans left, and also was when rebel groups, the Shiite groups, were fighting ISIS. They also assisted the Assad regime in fighting Islamic State in ISIS in Syria, which among those, they're predominantly Shiite militias in Iraq operating under the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is just another name, which is almost similar to what Hezbollah calls themselves
Mhm.
in Lebanon, for example. That is what's going on in Iraq. They're basically just another proxy of Iran at this point, because through them, the weapons go to Syria, they go to Assad. Eventually, they get to Hezbollah and indirectly through Qatar and the Moneygate scandal is how they get to Hamas, specifically in the hands of Hania, who would find secret ways to distribute them to Gaza, specifically to Sinwar, Def, and Isa, for example, to launch what obviously was October 7th.
Now, are the militias in Iraq, the terrorist militias in Iraq, are they popular amongst Iraqis, or are they like looked upon like, oh, like these annoying terror? Like, how are they perceived?
I think they're very, very, very underestimated with the war, with the focus being on Hezbollah, Hamas, and now with the Houthis and Iran. these groups in Iraq, they are violent mercenaries, especially Kataib Hezbollah and the Nujaba movement, as well as Asayib al-Haq. And you also have uh, other groups as well, which have been notorious with drone attacks and terror attacks against U.S. military. They both work together, but there's no one leader of Islamic resistance in Iraq. It's just organizations fighting for, a common cause, which is exercising, making sure that Shiite Islam is the predominant religion in Iraq, while also serving as Iranian proxies.
So Hamas is very, very popular amongst the Arab occupiers in both Jewish Gaza and Judea and Samaria. Hezbollah, I mean, it's not something that maybe all Lebanese welcome, but they're also not trying to kick them out of their country. So you can say like the Lebanese people accept Hezbollah or tolerate Hezbollah or celebrate Hezbollah, depending which side of the spectrum you're on. But in Iraq, how does the population embrace these terrorist groups, or are they also trying to fight against them? Do you know much about that?
Majority of the people do embrace those terrorist organizations, although there are a lot of people, specifically the Sunnis, who are trying to fight those terrorist organizations. Obviously, those groups have received training from the Badr organization, which is the one of the oldest proxies of Iran.
Mhm.
Badr organization also trained the Syrian army under Assad of how to be of how to be ruthless with indiscriminate murder. So with Iraq, the people are it's predominantly a Shiite country and a proxy, a failed state, as you can call it, which is why there's not much rumor discussions and hearing of people overthrowing the militias, whereas the government are basically their hands are tied by those militias. They know that those militias can wipe them out like this.
Right. And so the Houthis. Okay, so the Houthis, from what I understand, took over Western Yemen, right? Then they were in a war with the Saudis for years, right? Like no one really cared about that. Like they were like actually more mad at the Saudis for bombing Yemen, for starving out the Yemenites. But the Saudis give them some credit. They didn't care, right? So that's good for Israel to learn from the Saudis. Do what you need to do, stop caring what the world thinks, and do what's needed for your own safety. So, do you know some more information about what started the Saudi Houthi war? Because I wasn't paying attention at the time too much. And now the Saudis are not attacking the Houthis, right? So now it's Israel and the US only. So if you could maybe walk us through that entire scenario.
Sure. So most importantly, with the Houthis, you also have Iraqi militias having terror cells operating there, specifically which were
In
inspired
Yemen.
by, yes, in Yemen,
Okay.
specifically by Kataib Hezbollah, which was under the control of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was assassinated the same day as Soleimani was, as well as with Akram al-Kabi, the butcher of Baghdad, who was head of the Nujaba movement.
Mhm.
You also have the Khazali brothers who run Qais and Layth Khazali, who run Asai Balhaq, uh, which is the one of the oldest groups of Islamic resistance in Iraq. And also from in the Houthis, you also have cells from HAA, Harakat Ansar Allah al-Wafiya, which was one of the newer Iraqi militias, along with Kataib Said al-Shuhada, the KSS, which also has cells in Yemen, which those groups are what inspires Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the head of the Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis, to continue firing rockets and drones, because majority of the drones that come in from Yemen, they don't misfire like the rockets in Hamas. And we've even seen rockets misfire in Lebanon as well, just not to the same
Mhm.
scale as Hamas rockets.
So do you know why the Houthis are more accurate, even though?
Because they're using the same technology that the Iraqi militias
Oh,
use.
okay.
They're
Got it.
directly funded by Iran. Iran is using as many cards as they can on the table. We're seeing
Mhm.
what the IRGC, and we're also seeing what Ayatollah Khamenei is capable of doing, which you also put on the outline of Iran's connection with those groups, which is
Mhm.
important to see is that Iran's obsession is attacking Jews worldwide, which we've seen a few years ago. Chabad in Athens in Greece was attacked, as well as terrorist attacks were foiled in France during the Olympics last year, in Paris, as well as through Western Europe as itself, specifically in Amsterdam, which we saw what happened. It could have been a lot worse had we not foiled what we could have foiled in Western Europe and ultimately in London, which is where a majority of those quote unquote refugees who fled ISIS, the war between ISIS and the Assad regime in Syria, have ended up, which led to the slew of terrorist attacks, specifically in Nice in France in 2015. That is how uh, Iran uses these groups for terror, and most importantly, by creating outposts on college campuses in the United States, is how the ROGC is able to exercise a sphere of influence over Western society.
And so you're talking about, okay, in the US, we also have the Holy Land Foundation, we have CARE, we have SJP, right, Students for Justice of Palestine, and many, many others. So on one hand, George Soros and his Open Society Foundation funds a lot of these groups, but then also we have the governments, right? Like you have Iran that funds. So do you know like
We're
which
gonna have Hamas is founded. Holy Land Foundation is founded
is
directly by Abu
Hamas?
Marzuk, by
Right,
Abu Marzuk, who's now the head of Hamas. He
right. So
directly
that's right. So that's
to
Hamas. But the Soros Foundation funds GVP, they fund SJP, or the Open Society Foundation through the Soros Foundation. They also fund portions of CARE as well. So does Iran also do funding in the US through those groups? Are there other groups that we need to know about? How does that form together?
When it comes to those groups, especially CARE and the Holy Land Foundation, it's not only Hamas that funds those groups, but in a way, Iran does funds those
Yeah.
groups due to pragmatism, for example. Especially you have Nihad Awad, who is the executive director of CARE, along with Omar Ahmad and Ibrahim Hooper, which are uh, the behind the scenes people in CARE. And through them is what inspires SJP, the Students Justice for Palestine, on college campuses to conduct their activities, which they claim to be some of them claim to be acting on behalf of Hamas, some of them claim to be acting on behalf of CARE or the Holy Land Foundation. And the federal government has cracked down in the past under the first term under President Trump, where Shukri Abu Bakr and Hassan Elashi, the co-founders of Holy Land Foundation, were given life sentences for tax fraud, as well as providing support to Hamas, which has been a declared terrorist organization since 1993. But obviously, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the United States under the Trump administration, which I'm confident will happen with Kash Patel being at the scenes of the FBI.
I've just been disappointed I mean, I'm a Trump supporter. I through and through, I voted for him 3 times. I would vote for him another time. I've just been disappointed with him on Israel and anti-Semitism. So, for example, the whole anti-Semitism task force on college campuses. So when he pulled $400 million from Colombia, that was apparently conditional, right? So then he said, oh, well, if Colombia comes to the table and promises that they're going to stop doing XYZ, we're going to reinstate that funding. And that's what happened. But Colombia, we know, and a lot of these colleges can't be trusted because we're talking about fishing in an anti Semitic pond. There are no pro Israel professors, there are no very, very little, and they don't even get to have positions of seniority. There are no presidents, interim presidents that are pro Israel. In fact, the latest interim president, who I think left, so I think they're all like on their third or fourth one, had messaged the president during the hearings last year, telling her not to pay attention to the nonsense, meaning like these hearings are nothing to worry about. Everything will be fine. So here's who we have in charge. So what I don't like is that it's it's temporarily pulling funding. What he should be doing and his task force should be doing is completely cutting off funding. So cut off all funding, and it's not 400 million because Colombia from the federal government receives 1.9 billion. So he should have cut the 1.9 billion. That's it. Move on. Cut all of the funding from Princeton, from Columbia, from NY, the 60 schools that are listed. No ifs, ands, or buts, and
100%.
just pull it all. That is what would actually make a difference. Because here, and then also, like, it's not saying, like, oh, stop harassing Jewish students. If you read, and I'm sure you have, if anyone reads the conditions to reinstate funding, it's like to announce to the student or to adhere to the school policy of protests, meaning like you have to announce when this protests are going to be. There's nothing meaningful to combat anti-Semitism in these conditions whatsoever. So all of these Jews that are cheering the actions of the anti-Semitism task force, I cheered at first, and then I saw within weeks that they're reinstating funding if conditions are met. I think it's ridiculous.
You
And
also
then
mentioned
the whole Gaza deal thing, which like I can't even blame Trump for. It's more the Kushner Bibi deal. It's a anti-Semitic two-state solution wrapped in a bow to appease the Saudis because what they ultimately want, Trump, but even more so Kushner and Bibi, is to have a peace deal with the Saudis. And the Saudis, what's interesting about that, and I'm sure you know about this, there are more than whispers that the Saudi royal family are genetic Jews. And that makes sense with how they embraced the Wahhabi sect in the 1920s, because actually a lot of the Saudis were against Wahhabism. They said it's too extreme. This is just like a one-off group. We don't want to live like this. But if the rumors that are not so silent of them being genetic Jews is true, it makes sense why they would want to again like prove how Muslim they are, how of the land they are, right? Like even though they're genetic Jews.
similar
So
to the Taliban. They're also considered genetic Jews from the tribe of Zvolin or Naphtali.
well, we don't know exactly
30% of the Pashtuns
30%. So we don't know
are
exactly which
have
tribe.
alleged ties
Well,
to.
that's been proving by DNA tests. So, well, no, I'm sorry, we're wrong. 30% of Pashtuns are genetic Jews. A much
Correct.
smaller percentage ended up in the Taliban. So it's not 30% of the Taliban, it's 30% of the
No, I said 30% of the Pashtuns is what I meant to say.
Pashtuns.
That
Right.
30%
And
of
then
the Pashtun clan are have Jewish have ties to our people, like
exactly.
either
And they don't know, right, but they don't know which tribe, but they know that they ended up there through
speculated Zvolin or
through
Naphtali
the well,
tribes.
right, but they know that it was through the Assyrian exile that they ended up there. That
That's
they know. So, like all the 10 lost tribes were found through DNA tests. So my point is, yeah. So the whole like, like so how Trump is
also,
doing
you
on
want to talk
Israel.
about ZOA, about more Klein and Alan Dershowitz briefly as well.
Yeah. So we're rounding the edges.
I didn't mean to feel safe from you.
Exactly.
So
So yeah. So
yeah,
the thing is
we
like
have a bunch of uneducated people like more Klein and Alan Dershowitz among us who definitely use a lot of anti-Semitic terminology. Like instead of using as the Arab occupied population, uses the word Palestinians. We also have Shabbos Kestenbaum who is I think underestimating this what we're facing 100% of what's really going on in uh, in Jewish Gaza with the negotiations.
oh,
I
and also
think,
he celebrates when Israel was feeding the Arab occupiers
which
in
definitely is what
Gaza.
kept a lot of them alive, and uh, in a way, it was only by chance when Israel really got Mohammed Def along with Rafa Salama, who was head of the Han Yunis Brigade. But Salama's house was bombed. Both him and Def were killed instantly. I think that had they not been getting in food to Gaza, it definitely would have happened a lot sooner. It definitely would have forced Def to come out of hiding. He actually carried the name Def because It means guest in Arabic. He would change his location to avoid being bombed. He was a shadow, and so was Marwan Issa. Both of them were shadows in a way, which I think wouldn't have been as big shadows if only we cut off the food supply sooner than later.
It's also more than that. So there's been communication that's been uncovered, hidden communication that's actually hacked into by Israelis that show that in December of 2023, Hamas was ready to give up all the hostages, give up Sinwar alive, because even though Bibi was weak, and you remember what happened, Gallant, October 8th, said full siege on Gaza, no food, no electricity, no water. And someone asked him, oh, like what's like what if like the people die? And he's like, oh, whoever dies, like they're all part of the problem. And by the way, a lot of Jews are forgetting that 2,200 civilians from Jewish Gaza participated in the Jewish genocide, murdered Jews brutally. It wasn't just the terrorists from Hamas, because again, like, the entire population is Hamas. So something important for the audience to remember and never to forget that. So Bibi kowtowed to the libtards of the world, of Europe at the time, to Jihad Joe. And so there was very much like a very little partial siege of sorts. So even they were suffering, the terrorists, right? Like in November and a little bit of December. So by December, they were ready to do that. Then USAID, the libtard NGO, injected $2 billion to reinstate goods coming in. So the reason I call him weak for many reasons, but Bibi as a leader should have said, no, we're not having any aid coming in through Israel. And a lot of Jews pushed back on me on that, saying like, oh, but Israel needed weapons, his arms were tied. But Gaza was already bombed by December. They did a great job bombing it. They would not,
January,
right,
yes.
right. Israel would
January,
not.
we took out Aruri, the deputy head of Hamas. We've also took out multiple of took out Ahmed Gandour. We took out we also took out majority of Hamas's military wings, the military wing, not including Def and
By
Issa.
December, you're saying so by December 2023.
Yes, December
Yeah.
2023, January 2024 was
Yeah,
when we were.
it was great. Yeah. So then Israel would not enter Lebanon until September 30th, 20. Wait,
24, yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
until September 30th, right before
Oh,
Rosh
yeah. It
Hashanah.
was almost a year later. So Israel did not need weapons at that time. What they needed were the hostages to be back. And so again, like a lot of Jews, you're on social media, I'm on social media, and also we read publications and we see on the news how many Jews misinform and say like, oh, the war would end as soon as we get our hostages back. We were never in a war in Gaza to get back I mean, of course, like that was one of the reasons, but the actual war was so another Jewish genocide would never happen again. And in
Correct.
fact, having hostages there was an impediment to the IDF's action because they couldn't carpet bomb, because obviously we had so many hostages. We still have so many hostages. So the whole thing, Egypt, you have to give them some credit under Sisi. Sisi was also pressured by Jihad Joe to let in aid, open up your border, let in, like all this aid.
Correct. Egypt
Sisi,
relied on U.S. military technology.
Yeah, Sisi said, hell no. The most we're willing to do is 5%. 5% of all aid comes in through Egypt. Israel, under weak Bibi, said, oh, they're doing 5%, so we'll do 95%.
A big
So
mistake.
right. We've been feeding, like, I have had conversations about this. And then you have Shabbos Kestenbaum, who, by the way, I removed the podcast I did with him because half the podcast, like, he kept saying anti-Semitic terminology. I had to keep, correcting him left and right. And then I see him posting, he was literally celebrating when Israel was bringing in the aid trucks into Jewish Gaza. And I'm thinking,
It
how are
was
you?
all a ploy by Mazzini, by Osama
Yeah.
Mazzini, who's the spiritual head of Hamas, who's been the spiritual head of Hamas since Rentisi's assassination in 2004. And in fact, there's even undercover communication that Mazzini had written to Bibi via Khani and Aruri about letting the hostages go, which was actually in October. It was only uncovered in December because by October 16th, we bombed Mazzini along with Ayman Nofar, who was head of the Central.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that, but a little bit more slowly? So, because I
So,
don't know about this.
so
What
basically,
happened? Okay, what happened with the communication?
communication between Mazzini via Hania
Mhm.
and Bibi was that it was
And,
that
and when and when when was that?
in the second week of the war, right before
Uh,
before we assassinated Mazzini in October 16th of 2023, and was that there were talks about ending the war during the siege. Obviously, we said no. Mazzini was killed in an airstrike on October 16th. We eventually moved on to Ayman Siam, who was the head of the rockets and mortars unit, along with Rad Tabat and Ayman Nofal, who were high-ranking, reporting directly to Mohammed Def and Marwan Issa, which they would also be killed. Nofal was head of the Central Gaza Brigade. Tabat was head of manpower, and Siam was head of rockets and mortars unit. So by December of 2023 was when majority of the leadership, you also had the majority of the Nukba brigades were killed. Majority of military wing officials were also killed. Def and Issa were in hiding more than ever, as if there weren't in hiding years before the Jewish genocide took place. I think that was definitely a chance to completely obliterate Hamas and not go for the hostage deals, or maybe get back to women and children and then start doing it. What Bibi didn't do was that he allowed the aid to go in even after the first ceasefire in
And
November.
95% of it, 95%. Like, okay, I would not be as critical. Okay, Egypt. Okay, I'm sorry. Like, Sisi should be the president, should be the prime minister of Israel. He, like he did more
He's
against.
ahead of his time, a lot more ahead of his time
You
than.
know do you know what happened? And this should be interesting for the audience too. In 2014, the coup was enacted, right? So Sisi comes in. He
Was
obviously
enacted in 2013. Morsi is overthrown. The Muslim Brotherhood
Well,
is
yeah, in
kicked out.
2014, right. But what a lot of people don't know, and I just read about this about a year ago, in 2012, Hamas killed 16 Egyptian soldiers. And Morsi didn't do anything about it because, he let Hamas run amok all over the Sinai. He didn't care. Morsi comes in 2014. He has the Egyptian military bomb Rafah basically to pieces. 3,500 buildings were bombed in Rafah. Let's not call it Rafah. That's the actual Jewish name
Sure.
for it.
In
And
Rafah, it was
yeah,
obliterated.
Rafah, yeah. So 3,500 buildings were bombed by the Egyptian army. 1,200 tunnels, Hamas tunnels, were completely blown up. Then Sisi increased the buffer area between the Egyptian Rafah and the Rafah. So Rafah, for those who may not know, is split in two. There's half of Rafah is in Egypt, half of Rafah is in Jewish Gaza. So he increased the buffer between the two. And then over the years, when Hamas kept rebuilding tunnels, Sisi would flood the tunnels with sewage. I remember reading it in the New York Times. So, during this war, when we got hold of the tunnels in Rafah, and a lot of Jews were like, "Oh my gosh, like Egypt didn't tell us about tunnel." I knew about the tunnels in Rafah so many years ago. So clearly, Israel did too. Bibi Netanyahu did. So the point is that what Israel made the mistake also is that they treated and still do, they treat Hamas as if it's a legitimate country or a leadership of a country because,
Or
like
state actor. Treat Hamas like as a state actor, like the
exactly.
IRGC party.
Right. So here's my point. If you go into war, let's say with Egypt, right? Egypt is a legitimate country. So yes, there are things you cannot do. Like you sign an agreement with Egypt, you have to uh follow through, right? Like you can't violate that agreement. There is no reason many moons ago, right? Like how many hundreds of days ago, Israel could have gotten into an agreement with Hamas to release, like you said, the hostages. Then, because Hamas is a terrorist organization and not a state and not a country, they then could have just bombed the shit out of Gaza and did what it should have done, carpet bomb. they don't owe Hamas anything. They don't owe anyone in Jewish Gaza anything because they're all Arab occupiers and they're living under a terrorist organization that's not a real country. So does no one in Israel leadership, like, are they not thinking like that, or are they just treating it as if it's like an agreement with Jordan or Egypt? Like, I'm not understanding like where their mindset is.
I think it's just in a way of when you have the Holy Land Foundation and CARE, it's the like I think this basically is what is influencing the perspective on I think of how Israel should be dealing with Hamas and Al-Qassam, Al-Quds, Islamic Jihad, and those groups that are specifically in Gaza. I mean, needless to say, with
And Judea and Samaria, like, most
not
of the,
including Hezbollah, not including Iran, not including Iraq, the Houthis, but specifically terrorist organizations that have shown the capabilities of what we saw on October 7th, and that we've even missed multiple opportunities. We just thought that when we killed a big shot, like in 2012, we killed Ahmed Jabari, who was Mohammed Def's right-hand man and also temporary head of Al-Qassam brigades after we blew off one of Def's eyes in 2006, that this was, we've actually did it. In fact, it just enabled, we just, I think with Netanyahu, it was just enabling them to be more powerful than ever by not continuously the strike, by not taking more preemptive strikes against Hamas. And obviously, sure, like we eliminated like more than three-quarters of Hamas's military leadership, the military wing of leadership of Al-Qassam brigades by December of 2023. We took out Nofal, we took out Gondor, we took out Siam, we took
Mhm.
out Tabat, but the damage was already done. And I just think that with the aid coming in, and of course we have people like Kestenbaum or like a
Oh,
bunch
and
of
by the way, Shabbos custom. I'm not saying anything lashon hora. For those who are going to accuse me of it, I confronted him publicly and
he
personally.
just uses
All
anti-Semitic
of this.
terminology, which is
Well,
it's
not only anti-Semitic terminology, but he also went on podcasts. Again, this is all public information, where he lauded still a two-state solution, even after Jewish genocide. Like
can't do a two-state
you
solution.
have
There's
to
no way.
be genocidal against your own people to even think that. Well, first of all, there already is a terrorist state inside Israel. There's two of them. One is called Jordan, takes up 78% of our homeland, and then the other one, two-thirds.
No control of Judea and Samaria until
Yes,
we
yeah,
have
two-thirds, yeah, two-thirds of Judea and Samaria is occupied by a terrorist organization. How many more terrorist organizations do these Jews want Israel to share land with? Like
seven what
it's
we're
ridiculous.
fighting. We're fighting seven
Yeah,
terrorist
right.
organizations, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, whatever remains of the PFLP, if you even want to call them terror, like a legitimate terrorist organization, that's three.
No, but I'm
Hezbollah,
talking about like to carve out actual Israeli land. Like Hezbollah doesn't want like a part of Israel. I mean, I guess like you can count
I mean, how many
southern
terrorist
Israel
organizations do you
as
want on your border? I mean, Israel is
right.
facing a seven front war. Is
Yeah.
that's the, and I don't think that or a six front war if you really want to exclude Syria, but just for the sake of it, we'll throw Syria in there. It's like
Well,
how
yeah,
much
with now with Turkey, I mean, Turkey,
now we're starting with the back door there. It's even
well,
more.
not only that, like what we have in Syria is Turkish ISIS right up north.
It is ISIS with
Yeah.
HTS with
Mhm.
Tahrir al-Sham, and you also have have this new group in Syria. I think it's called I forgot what it was, but it's one of the main Sunni groups in Syria. Let me pull it up from my notes. But they're also working with HTS.
And how many Jews did I see on social media were celebrating when Assad fell? I'm like, do you know what's coming in next? It's going to be
I
even
think it was a mistake, a
uh,
big
right.
mistake to celebrate Assad's collapse. I
Because
think
at
it's
least at least Israel knew how to deal with Assad and,
correct.
and dealt with him quite well. Like, you remember how many times we bombed Syria because of the weapons cache, and like not that he like allowed it happily, like obviously he was not on Israel's side, but he was a lot better than what we're facing now. I'm like, yeah, like right now
Jaish
they're
al-Islam, that's new. That's the group in
which
Syria.
one? Which one?
Jaish al-Islam, which is headed by Zahran Aloush, who definitely was had ties to almost every terrorist organization. Basically, similar mindset of how the Islamic Jihad was created, how the Iraqi groups were created. Aloush also had ties to Recep Erdogan of Turkey. So yeah, I mean, Syria is, I think, now the biggest threat that Israel has to face, even more so than Iraq or even the Houthis in Yemen at this point. Like now the
They'll
backbone
be
of
the
Syria.
next threat because right now they're trying to consolidate power within, within Syria. But I think within 10 years, it's going to be the next threat. And it depends. And my last question to wrap our discussion, why did, and again, like nothing we can do about this now. Well, I mean, there's still a chance, but like you and I can't do anything about it. The Green Revolution, you have 80% of Iranians who are anti-regime, who are actually fairly pro-Israel, fairly pro-West. Why
Yes.
why did Israel and Trump first term not fund the Green Revolution, flood them with money and weapons, and let them topple their own regime? That could have been done.
That was a mistake by not funding them directly. Like, sure, Trump has made progress against Iran by pulling out of the nuclear deal, but I just think a lot more could have been done. Also, we have to keep in mind that Trump was eliminating ISIS, which I mean, obviously only took a year to eliminate ISIS from being effectively in control of Iraq and Syria, which ultimately I hope now Trump definitely funds the Green Revolution in Iran to allow the people to
But he's
top.
not, yeah, but he's not doing that. Like, first of all, he wants to
Need
negotiate
more
with
pressure.
Iran
They need
directly.
to
Then he
need more
wants to like,
pressure.
yeah, and then like if it's not negotiations, then he's like, oh, then we're gonna bomb your nuclear. First of all, why are you telling them what you're gonna bomb? Second of all, okay, fine, you bomb their nuclear
For nuclear
reactors.
facilities, it's impossible. You like it's not going to make a dent. I think what Israel did against Iran, sure, it was something, but I think a lot more should have been done after what
Unless,
Iran.
right, exactly. Unless the regime is toppled, nothing is going to work. And so if we keep Iran even weakened, you're still going to have the funding of Hezbollah, the funding of Hamas, the funding of the Houthis, and on and on and on. So until we cut the
Think
head
of
of the,
Islamic terrorism,
and even,
basically.
yeah, and even Shahrazani, who, like he was on the left, he was on my board before, even he, October like 9th or 10th of 2023, that's what he said. He said, we have to cut the head of the snake, which is Iran. So we're seeing this for almost 2 years now, right? Like a year, over a year and a half. Who in Israel is going to do this? Like there has to be just an assassination attempt to get rid of the
And I,
Ayatollah,
a
plus
lot of
working, right. And we have a lot of Mossad agents, as you know, within Iran. They can be,
they
you
can
know,
easily infiltrate the Irish.
and they can, but not only that, they have ties.
Not just the
They have
Quds Wars.
ties. Hold on one second. They have ties with the Green Revolution. So how is this not all being coordinated?
I think it's just a ploy for Bibi to stay in power at this point. He knows he's up.
Yeah,
He knows he's done. He knows he's finished. Now that we
exactly.
covered what he spoke about with Khalid Mashal and Ismail Khania, along with almost every other Hamas member, and definitely Saleh Haruri was definitely part of it. Like, of course, Bibi said, "Oh, like he wanted to kill Haruri before the war." Of course, Haruri was part of it. Haruri was number two of Hamas, and after 2017, he was deputy to Khania. I think
Right.
that it's just a ploy for Bibi to stay in power because if there's no drama, he's gonna lose. His family name will be tarnished forever at this point. I think Bibi has done a lot more damage than good. In the first terms, I believe Bibi was good in the beginning, but I think now it's a matter of corruption. I think it's
I don't
just
think he was ever, I was the biggest BB fan. Like I remember, where I live. Like I live in the city. And
right.
when he came in 2018, I didn't know anything. I was like your typical, American Zionist at that point. I was like, oh, Bibi, like, he's half Israel. He's all good. I didn't do any research on him. I was waiting for him for hours when his motorcade was passing on Fifth Avenue. And now I'm so embarrassed that I did because, okay, let's go back to 1997. He gave away 97% of Hebron to the Arab occupiers. 2016, he gifted cement to Gaza, which is Hamas. He
Chancellor,
apologized for it, remember? And that cement wasn't for buildings because the Saudis and the Qataris built up Qatar beautifully by that. I mean, built up Gaza beautifully by that point. the vermin use that cement for tunnels, a lot of it. So that was 2016. 2018, he met with Qatari officials, and this is public information. This is not like some conspiracy theory in
Also met with
Israel.
Mashallah Khania and
Yeah,
Roy in 2018.
right. But also like Qatari officials in Israel, and to funnel in up to I think the total was $1.8 billion to Gaza. And he's like, oh, but it was for humanitarian. No, no money going to Gaza is going for humanitarian purposes.
Goes
Second of
where it
all, Qatar has all the money to like
goes
do
to
whatever it
Islam,
wanted.
Hamas.
Right. Right.
It doesn't go to the people. It goes to Muhammad
Exactly.
definitely when he's
Right. So that was 2018 that he powered down weapons production, over relied on the US. He like lets in aid. I mean, like, how many mistakes can you make to put your population in danger after, before, and especially after Jewish genocide? Like it's like there are times I'm actually more mad at him and the Jews who support him than I am at like the terrorists, because you know what, the terrorists are going to terrorize, like that's what they are, right?
they're gonna do whatever, no
Our
matter what you do,
job,
they're gonna carry.
right, it's our job to enact strong, like I was in Egypt, I felt so safe in Egypt because Sisi put up checkpoints everywhere. There's military everywhere. Yeah, like it feels like a military state, but guess what? It's very safe. They got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood, 99% of them. So they did what was necessary. I went to Jordan. Jordan is safe. Checkpoints everywhere. Saudi Arabia, checkpoints everywhere. Everywhere I go, I went in the Arab world. It feels like a police state. It's annoying, yes, but there are no terrorist attacks from within their terrorist populations, right? Within those groups. Israel, yes, I felt safe before, but like people, like the Jews were screaming in America, like, oh my gosh, there are checkpoints in Judea and Samaria. Like Jews go through the same checkpoints. We've been through those checkpoints. So like not
For a
only
second, and you'll understand why we have checkpoints. Look how much damage, death,
right, but
death
you need to
caused.
have more. Like how does Tel Aviv not have a checkpoint coming in and out of Tel Aviv, coming in and out of Jerusalem, coming in and out of Beersheba? Like
Jerusalem for sure needs checkpoints, not
right,
just in
you need
Shuafat
that.
or
You need that, right? So until Jews are going to take enemies that we're talking about this entire podcast seriously, like, there's only so much we can do.
I agree.
Yeah. But thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I learned a lot from you. Like, for example, I had no idea that the that Hezbollah, or sorry, that the ICRG came from that the Iraq war, that Israel was involved. Like I didn't know any of that. I didn't know anything about the PLFP. So I learned a great deal, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be on the podcast or to be a returning guest on the podcast, and definitely look forward in the future being part of this podcast for sure.
Absolutely. No doubt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorraine.
All right.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye.